What's going on, everybody? Hopefully this is actually streaming right now. I don't know what the problem on YouTube's back end here is, but yeah, the link for that we sent out and all the promotional stuff has effectively started and stopped immediately, so that is now a dead link. So I'm gonna give this a second to make sure that on the YouTube backend that I have here, okay, everything's coming through here. Okay, that was a really weird way to start this whole stream, and when this is posted, most of this is gonna get deleted anyway. So sorry, everybody. Welcome to this week's LUMIX Live. Now that the link wants to work. As the description says, this is a special feature breakdown stream. So continuing off what it appears was a very liked stream last week, where we talked about the firmware updates and went through demos and talked about how the new features work, what's added to the camera, things like that. I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of continue some of that conversation with just some of the other features that we have. There's going to be a little bit of a rehash on some of the stuff from last week, because there's a couple questions that have come up about, like, you know, kind of explaining some of it a little bit better. So we're going to talk about, you know, like high resolution shot mode again this week. We are going to be diving in and doing some more demonstrations this week. So I will be showing you differences in the way the G9 Mark II and the GH6 handle lower ISO shooting. This is going to be something that's going to be relevant for both photo and video users. We will be going into stuff like Luminance Spot Meter, focus bracketing, the various other bracketing options we have in the camera, setting up things like custom function buttons, live crop, focus transition, all that kind of stuff. I have two cameras set up for this. I've got my G9 Mark II hooked up to the stream right now, and then we'll also plug in my S5 Mark II X, since these two cameras will have all of the menu options we're going to be talking about. Not every camera has all of the menu options, so a little bit of a kind of somewhat of a little bit of a headache there, but you know, we'll work through it clearly. If this is the first time you are ever joining LUMIX Live, these are broadcasts that we do every Thursday at 2 p.m., albeit we usually don't have these kinds of problems starting the stream, but I'll take it for the first time in the last year that we've had a problem like that. These are interactive broadcasts for you to have access directly to LUMIX, to people within LUMIX who can answer questions and provide insight into how our cameras work, how the features work, so that you don't have to go through the wealth of misinformation that is found online through people who may have never actually had their hands on with our cameras. With that, if you have questions that you want to ask during this stream, definitely ask them. Tag at LUMIX USA, as you can see D Creative has done in the chat there. It helps me see them on my side so that I can actually go through them, address them, or at least try to get through as many of them as we possibly can. Other than that, before we jump into the demonstrations and start going through these things one by one, I want to remind everybody in the US about LUMIX Pro Services. We have the Red and the Platinum tier available here in the US. Red is the free tier that if you've purchased a LUMIX camera, if you are patiently waiting for a G9 Mark II, which should be shipping very soon, make sure that after you get your camera and once the website's updated with that camera, get yourself registered on it. The Red tier, as I said, is free. It gets you your 3-year extended warranty on your purchase. You also get the portal access for any kind of problem or challenge you may have with the camera that may require a service submission. If you like having a higher level tier of service and support, we do also offer the Platinum level membership. That is a paid level service, and the Platinum tier gets you all of the benefits of the original Red program, that 3-year extended warranty, the platform, all that kind of stuff. But on top of that, you get 2-day repairs with next day shipping both ways, 20% off out of warranted repairs, annual sensor, EVF, lens cleanings, lens calibrations, firmware updates if you'd rather us handle that kind of stuff for you. You also get an exclusive hotline, which is open Monday through Friday, I believe 9 to 5 East Coast time. So if you would prefer to speak to somebody instead of go through email addresses, or if it's something that maybe isn't really appropriate for the live stream, something very specific to your use case, you have access to that platform. So definitely go take a look at that. So at least here in the US, it's lumix-pro.us. You can follow that link and get yourself all set up. Yeah, so, it looks like people have found the new link and they're joining in. So again, sorry if you were waiting on the other link and then all of a sudden things just stopped working. So, as we said, today we're gonna kind of cover over some of the more specialized features that we have in the Lumix cameras. And to start that, I want to talk about high-resolution shot mode because there were some questions that we didn't get to last week, and I want to provide a little bit more of an explanation on how this system works because you're seeing more and more of this kind of feature in cameras, especially in our cameras. We've been one of the longest companies doing it. I'm not saying that we are the oldest company doing it, but we are one of the oldest modern companies doing it. And if we look at my G9 Mark II here, I've got this one set up as kind of the demo camera for this because it actually has all of the feature set that is available currently within the Lumix ecosystem, but also all the stuff that, you know, is available that maybe your camera doesn't have if you're looking at this, or if you really do want to go into this camera, it'll be a good refresher for you. But with high-resolution shot mode on our cameras, it is designed to be a system that is easy to drop into and easy to get out of, so you don't have to do any kind of real menu diving to turn this feature on. It is on the top shoulder of the camera, so if we come back here, actually it's going to be a little hard to show because my camera's got a rig on it, but on my GH6, your high-resolution shot mode is going to be accessed through this dial here, the main drive dial. You're going to move this to the, not the burst modes. You're going to move this to, like I said, this is hard with the cage on here. You're going to move this to the option that has multiple kind of frames on it, but then it also has the dots in the middle of it. That's just our iconography for the high-resolution shot mode. Once you actually get it set up that way, and you have it into that mode, once you press the menu button on the camera, it's going to put you into the actual option here for high-resolution shot mode. Now, I was in the menus before, even though I have this mode enabled, so that's why it's out. But high-resolution shot is going to give you the higher options for, you know, better resolution if you want to go to the full high-res XL option. But you also have options for how you want to use the system. If you are getting a G9 Mark II or you have something like a GH6, which both have handheld high-resolution shot mode in the Micro Four Thirds side, or if you've got an S5 Mark II or an S5 Mark II X and you're running the latest firmware, you will have access to handheld high-resolution shot mode. So handheld high-resolution shot mode, as a bit of a kind of filler in of how this system works, our cameras for high-res shot are either going to take 8 images or 16 images, depending on the mode that you've got it set up at. The 8-image option is the standard tripod-based mode for high-resolution shot. This is what's found in the S1, in the S1R, in the S1H. It's what's found in the original G9. This is going to be the most basic method of doing high-resolution shot. Depending on the generation of the camera that you have, if you're on like an S5 or even into the newer cameras, Mark IIs, G9 Mark II or GH6, if you are leaving handheld high-res off, this mode also has the system for the motion blur processing. Now, motion blur processing in our cameras is the system that is designed to cancel out motion that is happening in the frame. There is a misconception online that you can set this to mode 2 and that is magically handheld high-res. It is not. Some people have gotten great results with it because they've got unbelievably steady hands, but this system is not handheld when you are just looking at mode 1, mode 2 for image blur processing. When you have this thing set up, if you go to mode 1, Mode 1 is basically going to say, hey, I am not going to do any kind of intelligent application of the 8 images to cancel out movement in the frame. So think rushing water, people walking through the frame, birds flying overhead, anything that's moving in the frame. This is what's going to get you the highest resolution possible, but you have a higher chance of running into some artifacts with a multi-shot stitched image like this. Mode 2, this is the mode that uses the multiple different frames to intelligently upscale, replace parts of the image that have a ton of motion in them, and give you still the high resolution image, because you're still getting 100 megapixels out of it, at least in the G9 Mark II's case and the GH6's case. But you will notice that things like rushing water, people walking through the frame, cars moving through the frame are going to actually be stable and not blurred out with the kind of multi-shot artifacts that you could see. But in certain little areas, as you look at it, you'll see that those are upscaled into the resolution. So the system does this in a very intelligent way, and you have the full-blown choice to kind of figure out which one works for you. So landscape photographers, if you're trying to do things like you want to extend your shutter speed, say you don't have an ND filter with you and you want to be able to do things like, hey, I want to blur the water in this scene, but I don't have an ND filter with you. Using high resolution shot mode is actually a very viable way to do this, because leaving it in mode 1 is going to let all of those frames for the water, which is typically you're going to be shooting at a slower shutter speed if you're trying to really get the effect, it's going to let that water actually show as movement. Trade-off being, if you've got a ton of trees in the scene, if it's a long enough exposure, you may run into some blurriness there, but it can work really well in very specific applications. I've had a lot of fun using it when I was out in Washington earlier this year for our Shutter Showdown project. Now, moving forward from that is where you'll have handheld high-resolution shot. Now, handheld high-resolution shot is the newer function that we've added. This is something that you are going to find in the G9 Mark II, GH6, S5 Mark II, and the S5 Mark IIX. These are the new things that we've added in here. So what handheld high-resolution shot is and how it is different than the standard high-res mode is that handheld high-res is taking 16 images. So your capture time and the processing time is a little bit longer than the standard mode. So not perfect for every scenario, but those extra 8 images allow the system to cancel out more than just the motion that's happening in the frame. It can actually counteract slight hand movement that you have just inherently while you're shooting. So the stabilization unit is active during handheld high res. When you do this, you'll notice that you don't have a choice for motion blur processing. It is grayed out because it is automatically going to be applying motion blur processing. But because it has double the amount of images to work with, it can do both the frame or the scene motion blur correction as well as the handheld motion blur correction. So what does this mean when you actually bring it out in the field? How do you know which one to pick? Well, if you're going to do something like my example before, rushing water, trying to mimic longer exposure, handheld high-resolution shot is not going to be the mode that you want to use there. You're going to want to put that into the tripod or turn handheld high-res off, set the camera on a tripod or a rock or whatever works that just keeps the camera stable, and set that motion blur processing to mode 1 to allow that motion to be shown through the image. You can get some really cool creative looks out of doing this, but just know what to expect when you're using these two various modes. Now, as we talked about last week with some of the images that I showed, handheld high-resolution shot is 100% a very viable, usable tool while you're actually out in the field. You just have to kind of know and think in the back of your head that if I'm in an environment where I need to be rapid firing a bunch of shots, this isn't really a mode for you. And that's where some people, I think, like to call it a bit of a gimmick. But if you are doing things like when I was walking through Manhattan, using handheld high-resolution shot in a very kind of more street photography sense where, you know, I want to do some architecture shots, I want to do some city streets, but I don't need to be capturing in high burst rate. It copes incredibly well with people walking through the frame, with cars moving through the frame, with a caveat if cars are moving ridiculously fast, you know, not necessarily the best mode for that. But it is going to get you that much higher dynamic range. That's actually not really the clearest way to say that. It's going to get you much better looking files than the standard image. You just want to know when to use it. The other things with high resolution shot mode is that you are actually getting a cleaner image based on the ISO that you're capturing. So if you're doing 1600 ISO or 3200 ISO, even on Micro Four Thirds, using high resolution shot in either handheld or tripod is going to net you a cleaner looking image at the same ISO as a standard 25 megapixel image. The reason for this is that noise that is captured within a single frame now is being filled with actual data or actual color and detail information because the sensor's physically moving. So those pixels that were at one point, you know, primarily dominated by noise now actually become filled with information in the stitch when it's put together. And this is done intelligently off the fly. You don't have to actually do anything with it. The other thing is that you actually get better color reproduction with images. So if you've ever run into situations where, say, moire might be an issue, or you run into situations where stair-stepping because of how fine a line is running through a frame, and 25 megapixel may not be enough to, you know, really make it a super smooth line. High resolution shot can help with that because it allows you to be able to kind of up the resolution, gives you more information to work with, and the kicker of all of this is that the camera produces it in camera. You don't need external software. It's not something that you have to install an extra program for and then add a new step through your process of editing. They edit just like regular standard RW2 RAW files in programs that support, in this case, G9 Mark II. So super straightforward to kind of work with. And the results you can get out of it, I encourage you, if you've got a camera that has it, S5 Mark II, Mark IIX, GH6, or G9 Mark II, once it's available for all of you, definitely play around with it. Find those situations where you think, okay, this actually can be very beneficial for me. Yes, a lot of images live online, and that means that ultra high resolution cameras may not actually be really as useful, quote unquote, in those situations. But you will find that the actual file is more malleable and that the overall image quality does actually visually come out as much better than a standard 25 megapixel image. Let's take a look at some of the questions that came through here. Just a reminder, Lumix has moved the registration site. The old site will take you to the new site. Yeah. That's all behind the scenes stuff. So as long as you use the link that we've got, it'll put you on the right space. Let's see here. The constant preview question. I will ask the engineers to look into that kind of setup. It's very hit or miss. Some people have a problem with it. Some people don't. It is the way that we do it. So there's not really much I can say right now. But if one of the things that I will say with constant preview, because you're talking about the shutter speed blur is something you don't want to see in the frame. Depending on the camera that you're using, and I want to make that very clear, it does depend on the camera that you're using. We have changed the options you have for constant preview. You can go to set, and when you're in aperture priority mode or manual mode, because these are the two modes that will activate for constant preview, you can have it not do the shutter speed effect. The shutter speed effect is the thing that I think some people get thrown off by, because if you've got a 1 second exposure, it's going to refresh the screen every 1 second because it's actually legitimately doing what it says it's supposed to do. Constant preview shows you what the image is going to look like, and that includes shutter speed. But knowing this, we set the option here to have it just apply aperture, which is really what the vast majority of people tend to be looking for. I'm not saying it's everybody, but the majority of people tend to want to do this to be able to see, one, the aperture, and two, the relative exposure of what you're going to roughly see, motion blurring aside. So if you set it to aperture and aperture for manual and aperture priority mode, now the system is going to actually just show you the aperture value to the point that it can without, you know, kind of in ultra low light scenarios, you run into a kind of upper barrier where you can only gain the view up so much on the screen. You have to then go into the live view boost function for that. But hopefully this is something that may help with your particular setup. But other than that, I would encourage you to play around with the various different settings. If your camera doesn't have it, it is something that I will bring up to the rest of the team about, you know, is it possible to bring that to other cameras? Let's see here. Dieter says, is the saving of the buffer on the SD card a bottleneck of the G9 Mark II? With the fastest SD cards takes 53 seconds. The OM1 only takes 9 seconds with a little smaller buffer. Any way to make it faster? Buffer speed clearing, or buffer, full-blown buffer clearing, is one of those things that it's going to be different between all camera manufacturers depending on where their priorities lie. I don't know if there's anything that our team will do to change the speed. And to be clear for everybody in the chat, this is something that is actually more relevant if you are someone who shoots, fills buffer, and then goes. The camera will allow you that once the buffer is filled, once you let go of the shutter and press the shutter again, it will allow you to continue shooting a burst until you fill the buffer again, and then you have to let go and press again. In real world practical shooting, and I've done a lot of high burst rate shooting with the motorcycle tracking that I do, I have never run into a situation where the camera is stopped and I can't take pictures with the camera, and that's in 60 frames per second burst mode. So whether your camera's taking 9 seconds with a much smaller buffer, or 53 seconds with our full-blown 60 frames, depending, and even that 53 seconds, it depends on the mode that you're in. If you're in mechanical, you're never going to hit the buffer. At least I've never hit the buffer on honestly any camera across the board. If those cameras had the same burst rates that we had, you'd have the same numbers. Let's put it that way. Let's see here. Do you know which editors other than Adobe and Adobe DNG Converter will support G9 Mark II at launch or at release? Not 100% sure on other editing software yet. Right now, the Adobe software came out with support a lot faster than even I was expecting. So that is going to be available day one out of the box. Other programs like Capture One or On One, things like that, they should be following soon with it. There are differences between the way the GH6 and the G9 Mark II are processed, even though they are very similar in the concept of the sensors themselves, but they are very different sensors between the two and the way that they work. So there are some out there that are doing some of the tricks where you tell the camera, or you tell the software that the camera's something else, or you edit the metadata. I highly encourage you, do not do that. You will not be getting the result that you expect or that it actually should be getting out of the camera, because it's not processing it as the camera that it is. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, don't mess with metadata on your files, because you can irreversibly break them if you don't know what you're doing. But yeah, it's definitely the other programs. My guess is going to be within probably 30 to 60 days of the camera releasing, or sooner. It just depends on that program. Other programs like Affinity and some of the others out there that are using the open source Libra archive, that is something that is up to Libra to be deploying. So it's not actually even Affinity's problem or anything, or fault or anything like that. It's whether or not the open source repository adds support for the camera. The information's there, especially if they have a raw file from the camera, which has been readily available from many different sources out there. So if they want to implement it and bring those programs up to speed, my best recommendation is just communicate with the program that you're working with, the software company that you're working with, and just voice to them that you want to see support for the camera sooner rather than later. Alexander, I'm new to Lumix, switched from an XH2S to an S5 Mark IIX. It's an amazing camera. Thanks for the work and time. Awesome. Welcome to the Lumix community. And yeah, it's awesome to have you. Let's see here. When are we going to see stock in Europe? So far, only Japan has seen stock. Is the Japanese market eating all the supply? No, this is... I said this a couple of streams ago with the G9 Mark II. Actual release date of a product throughout the globe can vary a lot because of transit, because of the time it takes from when those products get into country to when they get to the dealers, to then when they get to your hands. Obviously, in Japan, sometimes things can be just done a lot faster because they don't have to move as far. But I know here in the United States, we should start seeing them within the next week or two. For availability. I would imagine Europe's going to be pretty similar to that, at least in any of the major metropolitan areas. Other areas outside of major metropolitan areas, you run into just transit, things like that, which usually at that point, they're only a couple of days behind. So I encourage you to communicate with your local dealers. Major retailers are awesome if you want to get your cameras there. The little guys, the photo specialty dealers, as someone who used to work at a photo specialty dealer, definitely give you a nice extra level of service and support when you do purchase through them. So, yeah, always just follow up with your local dealer for when they expect to get them in there. But I will caveat, if you don't have a pre-order in, be prepared, because this camera has been selling pretty freaking well. As far as pre-orders go, so I will not be surprised if you don't have a pre-order in, if you're in for maybe a little bit longer of a wait until extra inventory arrives, past what pre-order inventory was. So, and that'll always be up to the dealer there. So, let's see here. Alan says, does dynamic range boost operate in high-resolution shot mode? Yes, it does. On the G9 Mark II, even in the GH6, DR boost does function in the high-resolution shot modes. In fact, actually, in high-resolution shot mode with dynamic range boost, it's why on the G9 Mark II, especially at lower ISOs, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that's why the G9 Mark II has such a major improvement throughout its whole system. Now, as we've said before, the sensor that we're using in the G9 Mark II uses the dynamic range boost function, which is it's a much more forward-thinking way of sensor like the way the actual sensor is hardwired and the way it works and the dual gains that are captured simultaneously from a single frame. High-resolution shot, because you're also doing more images of it, you get a better quality image than a sensor in a camera that may not be doing that kind of work on the way the sensor functions. And from an architecture level, the G9 Mark II, it's modern sensor technology. We've said and pointed out that it's, as others have pointed out, it's not a stacked sensor because we prefer to have the quality in shadows and details and the better highlight information than you get on stacked sensors. You have to actually lose information for stacked sensors. They are worse in low light. It is a measurable thing. So this sensor, we get the fast readout speed that we need for the frame rates and resolutions that we've packed into the cameras, even in the GH6. And we don't have to take the penalty of shadow noise creeping in that you see very commonly in stacked sensor designs. And then all the other, where the wiring is placed on the sensor, whether it's in the front or the back, that we are in the modern way of building these sensors. So yeah, it's a top tier performing sensor here. Kickbox Ritter, I remember asking a couple months ago if car bike detection was, if it's possible. He said, why would anyone want that? G9 Mark II. Yeah, so it's always hard to kind of answer some of those things with my job. So do you know, we talked about that one. Is there a possibility of providing full frame full frame 6K 60p recording without a stacked sensor? I mean, yeah, possibly. It depends on whether or not the sensor has that readout. I don't think the sensor does. And then you also run into, can the processors do 6K 60p? So as of right now, it's 6K 30p is what we've got. That's where the hardware's set for. A couple more questions, and then we're going to talk actually and show you the differences in this new sensor, in what performance we've got out of it. Regarding high-res mode, movement processing, are the moving objects still more detailed by some tech magic? What about shooting slow-moving objects like the moon? Handheld high-resolution shot useful? So, yeah, moving objects, when it takes... So you've got the 100 megapixel image, using the G9 Mark II as the reference here. 100 megapixel image, you are taking... When there's a lot of motion in the frame, it will take pixels that it can't basically combine because of that object has now moved. It will take those and then utilize the standard 25 megapixel image and intelligently upscale it. This isn't anything that's kind of new or out of the ordinary in itself. You can do this in Photoshop when you resize images. You just have to have a system that knows what to do for those parts of the image. So you will get better detailed parts of the image that have to be scaled versus just a standard 25 megapixel image, because it is being scaled up. In my experiences shooting with it, as the overall image is, just quality-wise and the way it looks, especially if I compare them side by side, I have a hard time seeing that there's any negative in the, rushing water, in the people moving, when you have motion blur processing 2 on. Second part of your question about objects like the moon moving, handheld high-resolution shot. 100% useful for it. I've done shots of the full moon in handheld high-res. The challenge you're going to run into there is that you have to be more stable than you think, because the moon is moving faster than you think, especially if you're trying to use like the 60 to 600 I've got back there. If you've got the 100 to 400 with the 2x converter on there, so you're at 1600 millimeter. At those magnifications, the object is moving a lot faster than you think. So you have to, it may take a little bit of some trial and error to get the exact shot you're looking for out of it. But it's 100% doable. So, all right, let's continue on here. So, actually, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to look at Lightroom for a moment here. So, as I mentioned, the G9 Mark II and the GH6 utilize a very similar sensor, but they are functionally different in the way that they actually work. So what I've got here to kind of show you is I've got a GH6 image and a G9 Mark II image here. These are both shot at ISO 200 with the 42.5 Nocticron at f1.2. So to start with, if I go to a comparison shot here, and we're looking at these are just based off what the meter picked in the camera. As we go through it, and we start to zoom in and look, you'll see, okay, without doing anything to the image, it's kind of slightly apparent, but the GH6 is producing more noise, especially in the shadowed region here. Now, where this really comes into play, and this is what I think a lot of people wanted to know about, how is the sensor actually different than the GH6? Well, it is an entire change to the way the system works. It is a hardware change and it is a software change. So if I just come in here and I jack up the shadows on both the GH6 image as well as the shadows on my G9 Mark II image, and let's give it plus half a stop exposure on these two images. And then let's go to the library here and let's do a side-by-side comparison. So visually, same image, right? We have the GH6 on the right, G9 Mark II on the left. Let's take a look at those shadows. Let's let it render here. Now you can clearly see, hopefully the resolution's coming through on YouTube. The GH6 at the same settings has more noise in the shadows for photography. The G9 Mark II is producing a much cleaner shadow range. This is thanks to the ability for dynamic range boosts to be pulled all the way down to ISO 100 through the setup here. You see this even in more shadowed regions like this, where if you really want to pull an image a lot, you really want to max out that shadow range, you'll see that to be honest, the GH6 is going to fall apart a little bit sooner. Now, this changes when the GH6 is put into, say, around ISO 800, because that's where dynamic range boost is active on the GH6 sensor for the photography side. So if you're someone who's a landscape photographer, even if you're a portrait photographer and you're working with flash, things like that, or you're working with, more dramatic lighting ratios, things like that, the G9 Mark II is going to be producing much better image quality for you. Even to the point, like I said in the launch video, from my playing around with these files, the flexibility and the detail that I can get out of these images does rival a lot of sensors that are much larger than what you have in the G9 Mark II. So you will be getting a lot of performance increase out of this, and this is going to carry over into the video side as well, since on the GH6, Vlog, obviously the profile that most people are going to be shooting in that are that techie involved in this, Vlog on the GH6 starts at 2000 ISO with dynamic range boost. So it was a relatively large jump from what traditionally we worked with. It was kind of like back to the old era of where 6400 was the log native ISO. Now with the G9 Mark II, Vlog's native ISO is now down to ISO 500. For those that work in full frame and in the Micro Four Thirds system, you may notice that this is kind of a splitting the difference in where the native ISO point is set. On cameras like GH4 or GH5, GH5S, things like that, the native ISO was, I believe it was 400 ISO, was at least where the programming was set for it. On the S5 Mark II, Mark IIX, and the rest of the S-series cameras, except the S1R, your native ISO for log shooting is 640 in the low range. So now you've got a very similar working environment between the previous GH cameras as well as the S-series cameras with your native ISO. And that's where you're going to get, the best performance of dynamic range versus noise, and the way the whole system works. Now, when you take it out of Vlog, this also allows you to go down to 250 ISO for being able to shoot in some of the other profiles, or down to 100 ISO if you're in things like 709, stuff like that. So pretty big improvements as far as the ISO performance, the noise performance, whether you're coming from photo or video. The big thing to remember with this is that the G9 Mark II is a photographer first designed camera. So that means that you don't have things like time code out. You don't have things like the focus transition. You don't have some of the higher level functions that you have in cameras like the GH6. You don't have tally lamps in the G9 Mark II. And most important, because of how the camera was designed and who it was designed for and by, you don't have unlimited recording on the G9 Mark II. So if you are in an environment that is much hotter, just keep that in mind. A GH6 is still going to be the better choice if you're in warmer climates than a G9 Mark II. But if you are in air-conditioned rooms, if you're in like a studio like I am here, where I keep my studio around 70-ish degrees Fahrenheit, so what is that, low 20s, I think, Celsius, I can get the camera to run and fill memory cards in 4K 24, 4K 30. When you get to things like 4K 120 frames per second, that is where you will have a bit of a slow reduction in recording times. And the G9 Mark II does allow for the ability to change the thermal limit on the camera. So under thermal management, you can set it to high and standard. High is a mode that is designed, and it's not out of the box. You would have to change this to high. High is a mode that does give you the warnings that you are telling it that it is okay for the camera to get much warmer physically to the touch. So just keep that in mind. Parts of the camera will heat up and you will feel it. So just kind of make sure to keep an eye on how you've got that set up. Let's jump back and take a couple more of the questions here. Let's see here. Okay, we answered that one. It's probably been asked before. We all know you love taking photos of motorcycles. I would assume you have a motorcycle yourself. In that case, what brand and model? I have two motorcycles. I have a 2019 Honda Rebel 500 in orange, and I have a 2022 Husqvarna Svartpillen 401. That's actually my wife's motorcycle. Really fun if you're into motorcycles. Little tangent there. Is it possible to enable deleting files from the computer while the camera is tethered? S5 and S5 Mark II. Probably not. At least at the moment, I know we can't, or it's not something that's doable with our system. Because of the way our cameras connect in for the tethering functionality through LUMIX Tether, you're not actually tethering into it as a media device. It is being tethered in through, I think it's PTP protocols. We have the entire, we have the SDK available for those that want to write their own programs for it. But I know direct file access, delete are not something that are possible right now. So, is it possible to do a burst of specific number of shots, such as 4, 8, 10, or 24, rather than just guessing how many you have? No. So the system will be either 20 frames per second, 60 frames per second on, say, like a G9 Mark II. The other cameras, if you're in electronic, it's either going to be 30 frames per second. If you're in mechanical, you're talking either 10 or 7. There's not like a tunable, hey, I want to take this many shots. So there's a workaround for it, because you could technically do it with things like exposure bracketing and stuff like that, but then you're dealing with adding another change to it. So yeah, it's not really doable. Let's see here. What SD card write speed should we look for best buffer clearance? V60, V90. The importance of a card speed for the Lumix cameras is more going to be down to what frame rates and resolutions and bit rates you want to capture as far as video goes. When it comes to the still side, even though like a V90 or an SSD is not really going to change the buffer clearing speed all that much, I still highly recommend at least V60 cards and faster. Mainly because a lot of times we forget the benefit that you're going to get with cards like V60, V90, and SSDs is that when you want to offload the footage to your computer, you're going to spend less time waiting for those files to come off, especially if you're in the video side. So I recommend doing some of the higher speed V60 or higher cards. We do have the list of compatibility for memory cards and SSDs. That is up on our website. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I'll make sure to add a link before the stream ends. So, hi, sir. I'm a user of Lumix S5 Mark II, but SSD not connected and Apple ProRes RAW not found in the S5 Mark II. If I have purchased paid update firmware, in this case, may SSD be connected to my S5 Mark II? So the S5 Mark II does not support SSD storage. If you want SSD storage, you have to go to an S5 Mark II X or a camera like the GH6 or G9 Mark II. The S5 Mark II, to my knowledge, is not capable of doing SSD recording. There are hardware differences in the way the cameras are built between those two models, and it's just not possible. As far as ProRes RAW goes, if you do get the feature add to the S5 Mark II to add RAW to that camera, it is only out over HDMI to either a Video Assist 12G or a Atomos Ninja or Shogun Connect product. Let's see here. Have you tried astrophotography with the G9 too? No, I have not yet. It is something I want to get into with that camera. 99% of the time, if I'm going to do astro work, I'm using a camera that is, at least because I have access to them, I'm using a camera that's better suited for it. I have a full spectrum converted S1R back there on my shelf. Some have seen it. That I use that camera primarily for astro work. It's possible to get pre-recording on a mirrorless camera via firmware update. If action cameras have this function, it should be working on these. Question mark. I'm using an S5 Mark II and a GH6. You mean like pre-roll? I mean, it might be possible. I don't know. We don't have pre-burst function in video sense. I don't think we have in our mirrorless cameras. We've had it in camcorders, but the data throughputs and the rates and stuff like that are going to be very different between cameras. Camcorders, especially action cameras, they're much lower in the overall, not performance, in the demanding nature of the processors and the sensors. So that I'm not 100% sure of in these cameras. What is the highest ISO while shooting video on the G9 Mark II, and how does it vary with different frame rates and picture profiles? I don't know off the top of my head, and that's actually a pretty in-depth question. So, Animal, let me do a little bit of kind of setup on that. We'll probably talk about that next week, just because that's a lot to go over right now. In the stream. I didn't know that that was going to be a question asked. So, yeah, let me go through that, and then I'll make sure that that's a topic for next week's stream, and we'll have very clear information for you. Let's see here. Let's, I have a question about DR boost and G9 Mark II. On GH6, we can have 3 more stops when using this mode. Will we have the same extra stops when ISO down to 500? So, dynamic range boost on the GH6 really only ever provided about a stop extra leeway in the highlight region on the way the system worked. It didn't really change much in the shadows on the GH6. On the G9 Mark II, one, you're going to be shooting at a lower ISO value, so you're going to have cleaner shadows, cleaner overall image. 2, you are still getting the expanded dynamic range functionality out of the camera, so it is going to be a 13 plus stops. But what you'll notice on the G9 Mark II is that because of the system being completely rewired and redesigned, you're going to have a little more flexibility in the shadows. You have a lot more latitude in the highlights. So if you're someone who uses, which this is a perfect segue, if you are someone that uses tools like Luminance Spot Meter, this is where you're going to be able to actually get the most out of the camera. It is going to get you a lot more kind of quick access control for how much dynamic range you want to work with in the camera. So let me set this into video so we can actually show this a bit here. In video mode. Hey, my switch. I updated the firmware, and now it works fine. All right, so Luminance Spot Meter on our camera. There's a couple things that you have access to with this. So for one, let me put this into log. And then let's get the ISO value up here. This isn't anything that we're really going to be looking at major here, so I'll just keep the ISO values up high here. So with the way this system works with Luminance Spot Meter, and I'm going to use a color checker here so you can get a rough idea of what we're looking at. You have a couple things that you can do with setting, accessing things like Luminance Spot Meter. So first off, buttons on the rear of the camera, and actually many of these buttons here, even some of the front ones, if you press and hold this button for about 3 seconds, the camera's going to drop into a menu choice that's going to let you program that into a certain function or tool that you want to use. So in my case, if I press and hold one of these buttons, you'll see that it drops into my FN10, which is the right on the rear command dial. And I can select Luminance Spot Meter. Now, when I turn Luminance Spot Meter on, you'll see that I get a target box that I can move through the frame. And right now, I've got it on my gray card. And what this is saying is that right now, this particular spot is 1.6 stops overexposed from 42% IRE. 42 IRE, or 42 IRE, not 42%. 42 IRE. That is what 18% gray is designed for. So that's what your skin tones should land at when you're using a waveform to judge your exposure. In this case, the Luminance Spot Meter gives it to you in stop values. So what this means is that, well, according to this, I'm actually a bit overexposed. So I can stop. Actually, I'm underexposed. So I'm underexposed based off the meter, but I'm overexposed based off of where gray should be. So if I actually, through ISO, I'll do this. So if I actually start to bring my ISO value down here, and I bring it to, say, 1000 ISO, you'll see that my gray card is now actually pretty much neutral. It's still about a half stop over, so we'll bring this down to 800. Yeah, there we go. We're at 0, effectively. What this means now is that I would have the maximum amount of dynamic range that I can capture here through lighting the scene. Yes, of course, some of the regions down here, next to the S5 Mark IIX that I have back here, some of those regions, when I actually apply a grade to this, so like if I come in here and say, actually I'm going to change the color profile. We're going to change this to real-time LUT. So if I'm in real-time LUT, and I set this to, let's actually set it to a proper LUT designed for Vlog. Let's go to 709. What this tells me is that if I were to just do a straight Rec 709 conversion, that's about what I'm going to get. My shadows are crushed. The general way the system looks, you get the point. It actually looks very close to how you see it with your eye. If I want to maximize dynamic range, or if I know that I'm going to have to pull information from that shadowed region, this is where I have the ability to actually come in here using the Luminance Spot Meter tool. And if I go back to log, so it tells me what it is. If I have a very specific point, so let's say in the shadowed region here, let's say I want to make sure that I have information in this lower section here. Now this is 8 stops underexposed. I have a couple of options here. I can start to raise my ISO value up until you start to see like, hey, that part of the image, that is, without adding additional light, that's pretty much gone. That is down in the shadow. That's way down in the basement, because now I'm having to set 4000 ISO here. Or I can, by shifting some light, let's see if I can do this and get it there. There we go. We'll shift some light around. I can take this piece here, and you'll see that, okay, now I'm getting around 4.7 stops under. Down in the grip portion here, I'm at 4.3 stops. So now I know that I've actually been able to get some of that information out of the shadow. When I go back to my gray card with Luminance Spot Meter, you'll see that now that that's about 2 stops overexposed from my base image here. Now, if I had a specular highlight in this particular image, or a very bright, kind of scene in this image, I would also be able to move this dial over to where that, kind of specular highlight is and see what that spot actually looks like. This is how you can get some of the maximum flexibility out of your files. You can either, as I said, as a little bit of a recap, I can either set this to say, hey, I want this particular image so that I am getting proper exposure on my skin tones, but I know that when I make my conversion to 709, that it's going to be very contrasty, which at that point I can just add more light to the shadowed region, and that will allow me to bring those shadows up for how it looks in final. Or I can try to forcibly overexpose, knowing that I'm going to be lifting my middle gray, my 18% gray, up 2 stops, and then I'm going to have to bring that into post and start to bring those down. There are benefits, there are negatives to doing both, but that's how you would utilize the tool like Luminance Spot Meter to be able to come through and say, you know, how dark are these shadows in this range? How bright are my midtones? How far over are they actually, you know, kind of showing? And like I said, with Luminance Spot Meter, if you're not shooting in log, you would want this to be close to around 42%. That's roughly the equivalent of where you would want this to be so that your skin tones look like natural. They look neutral in the way they come across after grading. Let's see here. A couple other questions came through. Notice there's a delay on the S5 2X's LCD screen, LVF, when shooting video, which is inconvenient, especially for manual focusing. Can it be fixed? Thanks. I've not seen a delay like that, so I'm not 100% sure what you've got causing that. If you give us more information about how you've got your camera set up, I can try to help troubleshoot what you may be seeing there. Could you suggest firmware change to exposure bracketing? My camera will allow 1.5 or 2 stops bracketing rather than shooting 1 stop and throwing away a stop we don't need. Yeah, that is something that we have asked about, if we can change that. Looking forward to the next stream. Yep. So Animal, yeah, I'll make sure that we have that covered in there. Let's see here. The new DJI Mic 2 now operates over Bluetooth rather than needing a dedicated receiver. Please work with DJI to support S5 Mark IIX and G9 Mark II. So here is probably the thing that nobody is telling you about the fact that about Bluetooth audio for digital cameras. Unless the camera in question has the ability to do Bluetooth low latency, you do not want Bluetooth audio recording to your camera. You will have perceptible latency in the audio. It will not match with the camera. So until camera hardware actually adds things like low latency modes or things like AdaptX low latency, which is a Qualcomm technology, you probably won't see those come into cameras. It's different on things like mobile devices because most of them are either Qualcomm or Apple or Exynos processors, and they work with Qualcomm and they have those typical functionalities. But Bluetooth audio or Bluetooth audio listening are still probably a ways out when it comes to interchangeable lens cameras, because that is not something that can be firmware added. That is something that requires hardware to be able to do. Will 20 times punch-in focus assist come to video shooting and not just photo mode? I have actually asked for some clarity on this with our team here. So, let's see here. Can you do time-lapse in camera with high-resolution mode? What's the processing time for frame? Time-lapse and high-resolution mode do not work together. To do time-lapse with high-resolution shot mode, you would need to use an external time-lapse controller, which they exist. I've done it before. About the time that it takes for processing an image, if you're in handheld high-resolution shot, you could be talking about, maybe 3 to 8 seconds. It's almost about a second per frame that it's got to kind of compile to it, and it also depends on how much motion is in the image. If you're on tripod mode, a good safe bet is usually probably around like 5 to 10 seconds, and you know that you're going to be okay. The file's recorded. But once you get the notice on the back of the camera that it's compiling the images, you can move and start repositioning for the next shot. Let's see here. Chris, just something to pass on. An open gate Cinecam with internal NDs or IBIS would be awesome. Mini XLR is fine. Maybe run VBR batteries. Thanks. Yeah, we've heard a lot of that one, definitely. Let's see here. Is there a reason the S5 Mark II can't record to SSD? Yes, this was a question that I saw come up before. Is there a reason the S5 Mark II can't record to SSD? Is this something that could be added with firmware, or is it a physical limitation? From what I have seen, it is a physical limitation. The main boards, the design, the actual build of the camera between an S5 Mark II and a Mark IIX are different. I don't know if that is 100% that it is just not possible at all, but the S5 Mark II is not getting SSD recording through the USB port. because it is not capable of doing it. If you need that function, and we've tried to make that as clear as we possibly could from day one between those two cameras, if you need that, if that is something that you actually really need access to, an S5 Mark IIX is going to be a camera that you're going to want to go for, or G9 Mark II or a GH6. Will you and Matt be going to CES in January? Yes, we will be. It's pretty safe bet that both of us will be there for that. Let's see here. Leo, trying to install the new firmware on my S5 Mark IIX. The bin file is downloaded. Should I place it on the root directory of my SD card or within one of the folders, DCI and private? You want to leave it in the root of the card. Do not put the .bin file into any of the subfolders on the card. The other thing to make sure of is if you are coming from a Mac especially, make sure that you are actually copy and pasting the file to the SD card and then properly ejecting the card from the computer. On Windows, still a good process to make sure that you copy and paste the .bin file to the root of the card and then properly eject the card. A lot of times what you don't realize, especially on Windows in this case, and I think even on Mac, is that in some cases it's actually only making a shortcut to the file that you've set until you tell the OS to dismount the card, and then it finishes writing the things that are being done in the background. So as long as you make sure you do that, you'll be good. Cool. So what were the other things? Focus transition, live crop, custom function buttons. So we did talk about custom function buttons, but I want to talk about the bracketing function here. So we talked about, someone mentioned before about bracketing on the LUMIX cameras, and with our cameras, we have a number of different bracketing functions built into our system here. And bracketing, whether or not you want to do exposure bracketing or focus bracketing, you have a lot of this kind of functionality here. Before I go into that, is Bluetooth supported between DJI RS3 and S5 Mark II a possibility? I do not think so, because I don't think the systems have the functions or the proper needed Bluetooth controllers between the two. All right, so bracketing here. So we have multiple different ways to do bracketing in the camera. There's the typical exposure bracketing, which is going to give you this icon. That's going to let you be able to choose. In our system currently, you have 3-step at up to a third or 1 stop, and it gives you a visual representation here. You have 5 images or up to 7 images at one EV separation. I know some people have wanted the various different versions of this where you can do 2-stop variants between those images. We've asked. I don't know if it's something that's going to come, but we have this function here. You also have the ability to come in here and say, hey, take all of them when I press the shutter, or take each one as, like, I have to press the shutter for each one of those, in this case, 7 frames. Typically, I set it to do click the shutter once, let it run all the frames together. You also have your sequence settings, so you can say how do you want these sequences saved. Typically, I do 0, plus, and then minus, but you can do 0 or a negative all the way up to plus. So that's one of the basic things, is exposure bracketing. But we also have aperture bracketing in our cameras. Aperture bracketing, which is actually a really fun one to work with, can really help if you're trying to understand, or, hey, how does the aperture value work here? So I can come in and say, hey, how many images do I want? I want all the images in this case. So I've got my 42.5 Nocticon set on here, and you'll see right over the f-stop number on the bottom, you'll see a little BKT, which is bracketing option here. And now when I press the shutter, it will take a bunch of different images. In this case, some of them are slow exposures, and it's got long exposure noise reduction there. And it's going to run through all of the aperture values available on this lens and capture those images. So f11, f8, f16, f22 if the lens has it, and it will capture all of those images at the various different aperture values. So now you can go back and say, well, which one did I like? How did I want that image to kind of look? I'll come off this while it's finishing that, and be able to pick the aperture value that you think works best for your particular shot. So now we're done with that. That's one set of bracketing you have. The other here is going to be focus bracketing. Now, focus bracketing, this got asked actually a little while ago, but how does it work with our cameras? Well, for one, focus bracketing can work with third-party flashes on the G9 Mark II. This is where I can have a single pin fire flash, and it will wait for each of the recycles of the shutter to fire. Now, for that, you have to make sure that you're using a flash that can actually fire fast enough for the bracket based on your shutter speeds that you're using. So just kind of keep that in mind. You have step control here. So this is how coarse or fine you want the movement to be. So I'm going to set this to 5 for this demo. And then you have how many images you want to capture. So in this case, I'm just going to set this to 25 images just to kind of get the point across. So we're at 25. And then here, I want to have this start at 0 and then go out. So with something like this, which is why I'm in manual focus, so you can see peaking with this, I want to bring this as far forward as this lens goes. So say I want to start here at the locking dial for the Condor Blue handle I have on this. So once I've got this set, now I'm in focus bracketing. So I can click the shutter, and now the camera's going to actually move the focus motor through the frame at that coarse setting from near to far, and give me images that I now have for focus bracketed. So when you do any kind of bracketing mode, it's going to put this into folders for the camera. So in this case, you'll see on the bottom left, it says focus with the bracketing symbol. Your aperture bracketing is going to come up as just regular images. So here you'll see we've got f1.2, 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5, 6. So this is going to do the main aperture values for it. The focus bracketing image, as I come through this, I can actually go through, see, okay, where is that image going to be? Which position was that I liked? You know, okay, maybe I want this to move a little bit more forward. So I can, while I'm zoomed in, I can go through and see what the steps are. And then be able to go through and take these into software for blending those images together and doing stacked photography. We don't do stacked photography in the camera, but we give you the tools to have the RAW and JPEG images for focus stacking later at your discretion. A couple other questions here. Kirk says, will the S5 II receive multi-exposure functionality? I do not know at this point. Any chance for the S5 to receive handheld high-res mode via firmware, or is this hardware restricted? This is hardware restricted. Handheld high-resolution shot requires a much higher precision gyro and stabilization unit that the original S5 doesn't have. Same with the original S1, or the S1, S1R, S1H, the original S1 series of cameras. So, yeah, those cameras just don't have the hardware for it. The newer cameras do. On my S5 II in photo mode, especially in manual, when I press the back button, focus the shutter before the shot, the exposure on my display changes. Constant preview settings don't fix this. I get what you're saying. I think I've seen a couple of your comments about it. At this point, you can try changing this to aperture priority or the aperture settings for constant preview. I understand what you're asking, but I am not experiencing the same, I guess, challenge. So I would have to know some other things. Are you shooting in flash? Are you shooting at real slow shutter speeds? Are you shooting at like what ISO values are you shooting at? Some of those things can help me try to troubleshoot what you're seeing. And at that point, we can figure out if it's just the way our cameras function, or if it's something that a setting may need to change. All right, last thing that I have time to cover today, actually went a little bit longer than I thought on the rest of those, is let's talk about the some of the other video functions that are a little more special with our cameras here. So we have, in many of our cameras, we have tools like focus transition, we have segmented file recording. These are a couple of the things that we've added to our cameras that you typically don't see in this category of option. Focus transition, and we've talked about this one a little bit before. Focus transition is a tool that allows me to set focus pull points. So if I say I want to bring this as close as possible, well, a little bit further than close as possible. So right onto that particular spot on the camera here, you'll see I can then click white balance because I want this as position 1. Then I can rack focus to where I want my second position to be, which let's say is like right in the middle of the Lumix logo. Then here I can press the ISO button and set position 2. And then I can go all the way out here to my S5 II that I've had hidden in the back there. And I can set this to position 3. So now I've got all of these positions set up. Now these are relatively close because it's close working distance for this particular shot. Once you've got those 3 set, just press the set button, and now while I'm moving through, and I have to use the joystick for this just because I've got it connected out over the HDMI, I can come in here and I can select and say go to position 1, go to position 3. And these will be repeatable focus pulls that the camera can do if you are doing, kind of very complex setups of a shot. If you know that you want to be able to do multiple takes and run through a focus pull. You also have, if I press the display button here, you also have the ability to change the speed of this. So I can change this so that it is super fast. So right now I've got it set to SH, so we're at position 1 right now. Let's change it to position 3. You'll see it's very fast for a pull. So think of this as like, I really need to be able to jump in and out of focus with this. But I also have the ability to come in here and make it painfully slow. So now we're still at position 1. So now I can come in here and change this to position 3. And you will see with the focus peaking here that it is a very slow, gradual focus pull through the range that I've got set up. This is a very unique feature that we've got in our cameras, and now it's in a G9 Mark II, it's in the GH6, it's in a lot of the other cameras, the higher end cameras that we have as well, that are very video photo focused. It is very much a video feature, and it is one of the kind of higher end setups that we've had here, so it is something that if you know that you need to do focus pulls, definitely play around with the focus transition functionality. Couple other questions that just came in here. When taking photos with speed light and TTL mode, does the camera control flash output power or speed light auto adjust output light power? That will depend on the flash you're using, FC. If it is a self-contained TTL mode on the flash, it will handle it through a sensor on the flash itself. There were older flashes that have like the sensors built into them for power. But TTL by its definition is through the lens, so it's matching to the camera's meter to then judge when the cycle has to be cut on that power on the flash for power. So it is done through communication with the camera. That's why TTL flashes are coded for the cameras that you're using them. In our case, if you do want to use TTL, make sure that you're using a flash that is the Olympus Panasonic TTL flash protocol. Do any modern Lumix cameras support in-camera focus stacking? If not, I vote for that to be in the next G9 Mark II and S5 Mark II feature. So the only cameras that had in-camera stacking were the cameras that have the 4K post-focus functionality. We have gotten rid of the post-focus and stuff like that. Yeah, we don't deploy those anymore in the cameras now that frame rates, resolutions, and stuff like that have gotten pretty fast. We don't necessarily need them in focus bracketing, but we can bring it up to the engineers that people are asking about these modes at this point. The reality is, if people didn't use a feature, eventually a company's going to kind of not deploy them into the newer cameras, especially when you're moving to a totally new engine and new architecture. Was Cine file naming added to the S5 Mark II or G9 Mark II? No, Cine file naming is something that's going to be held for the actual more Cine designed focused cameras. S5 Mark II and G9 Mark II, especially G9 Mark II, they are photo first cameras. They are well suited for video, but cine file naming is going to be in GH cameras in, yeah, GH6 at that point. Focus transition function would be great for focus bracketing. I believe Canon and Nikon has a system similar for their focus bracketing. You set near and far range and go. Yeah, I mean, our focus bracketing is just a little different than what you see, because ours is you just set the start point and then you tell it you want to go out or out and then also back for it. And then you just have to tell it how many images you want. Let's see here. We did that one. Any chance that S5 is going to receive the ability to turn waveform vector scopes on and off while recording? I don't know if there's going to be any changes like that for the original S5. What do we got here? Keep bright and darker. Taking photos of speed light. Okay, we answered that one. Okay. Let's see here. So, unfortunately, I am out of time, so I missed the live cropping function. So I will make sure that we'll add that as part of next week's stream, so I apologize. It was a little bit of a rough start to get the stream going, so that kind of threw me off a little bit for timing this week. Outside of the information for today, thank you, everybody, for tuning in live. These streams are a ton of fun to do. I love having these conversations. I wish I could get more time to be able to do these within these streams, but for the one thing, as a playback, these are already a little bit long. I mean, almost every week we're pushing almost an hour and 30 minutes for these streams. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for all of your questions. It is awesome to see the interaction. It's awesome to see that we're getting more and more people tuned into these. If you know people that would be interested in these streams, if you come across people that have questions about how to use our cameras or just want the opportunity to actually interact with us, with me and the brand, please let them know. We do our advertising, but word of mouth and recommendation from others, if you see value in this, is what helps us and helps me grow the community that we have here. As always, if you have questions and we didn't get to them, I apologize. There are a lot of stuff. There are some questions that I just can't answer, so unfortunately I do kind of have to go through some of them. Leave a comment in this video afterwards with your questions, or even if you just have comments about the streams, recommendations for future topics. We're trying to go through those as fast as we can and make sure that we don't have any issues with profanity or spamming on the comments. That's one of the reasons why we have them moderated, because we do get a fair bit of spam comments and language problems that we can't have up on the page. Other than that, we will be live again next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. A little additional programming note. The following week, I will unfortunately be having to have a recorded stream the following Thursday. So I'm still working out on what the details are going to be for that. But we will be live next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you liked the content, if you liked the information that we shared, and you feel that we deserved it, give us a like, subscribe, share the video to people that you think may be interested in these topics and this information. And hopefully by the end of the day, midday tomorrow, I will have this video annotated so that you'll be able to jump to various different sections, trying to get better at that. But otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. I hope you have a great, awesome weekend. Get out there, create some cool stuff. Share it with us on the social platforms, and yeah, look forward to connecting with you all again next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Later.